When I first moved into the Willow Bend neighborhood, I thought it was going to be peaceful. Quiet streets, tree-lined sidewalks, friendly neighbors, it all looked perfect. That was until I met Janet, the HOA president. Janet was the kind of person who believed her clipboard gave her power over everyone within a mile radius. She had a permanent frown, a sharp tone, and an obsession with rules that no one else even knew existed. It wasn't long before I found one of her letters taped to my door, a printed notice with bold letters demanding that I repaint my house. Apparently, my home's cream color was not up to the HOA's approved shade list. I stared at the letter in disbelief. My house was perfectly fine, freshly painted, and matched the style of every other home on the street. But Janet didn't care.
She wanted control.
A few hours later, she was standing in my yard, hands on her hips, looking at my house like it had personally offended her. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice sharp as glass, "this color does not meet the aesthetic guidelines. You will need to repaint it within 30 days. I took a deep breath, trying to stay polite. "Janet, I just bought this place. The paint is new, and it matches the original design from when the house was built in 1928. She raised an eyebrow. "I am aware of the year," she said curtly, "but those old guidelines are outdated. This community has standards." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I asked her if she had any documentation showing that the color was not allowed. She simply said, "You can check the bylaws yourself," and walked away, her heels clicking against my driveway like tiny hammers of authority. That night, I did check the bylaws. Nothing about my paint color was against the rules. So I decided to dig deeper. The next morning, I called the county records office, curious about my property's history. The clerk sounded surprised when I gave my address. "Oh, that house," she said. "You know it's registered under the local historical preservation list, right?" I froze. "Historical preservation list?" "Yes," she continued cheerfully. "Any modifications to that property have to be approved by the historical committee, not the HOA." And there it was, the golden key that could unlock Janet's smug expression. I spent the next few days gathering every document I could find: historical registry, certificates, old photographs, newspaper clippings, even a scanned copy of the original building permit from 1928. When Janet came by again, clipboard in hand, ready to issue her next warning, I was waiting for her on the porch with a calm smile. She barely said a word before I handed her the folder. "You might want to check with the city before sending any more of your letters," I said gently. She frowned, flipping through the papers, her confidence slipping away with each page. "This can't be right," she muttered. "This neighborhood is HOA jurisdiction." I nodded. "It is, but not my house. Mine is legally protected under the historical district rules, which means only the historical committee can authorize changes to the exterior, including paint color." Janet's mouth opened, but no words came out, her face turning pale as the reality settled in. I could almost see the calculations running through her head. All those warnings, all those fines she had tried to issue, all invalid. A few days later, a letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from the historical committee themselves. Apparently, they had been notified of Janet's interference and decided to open a review of the HOA's actions in historical zones. That review spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and soon half the residents were questioning every rule Janet had ever enforced. It turned out she had overstepped her authority multiple times, issuing fines for things she had no control over. By the end of the week, a city representative arrived to speak directly with the HOA board. I watched from my porch as Janet tried to keep her composure during the meeting, her once confident voice trembling under pressure. When it was over, she walked past me, avoiding eye contact, her clipboard hanging loosely by her side. I didn't say anything. I just gave her a polite nod and went back to tending my garden. Later that evening, one of my neighbors walked over, a big grin on his face. "You did it," he said. Word spread fast. "Apparently the committee is looking into removing Janet as president." I laughed softly. "I didn't do anything. I just read the rules," she ignored. The neighbor chuckled. "Yeah, but sometimes that's all it takes." That night, as the sun set over my freshly painted house, its cream color glowing softly in the fading light, I couldn't help but smile. The place felt quieter, somehow freer, like the house itself knew justice had been served. And somewhere across the street, Janet's blinds shifted just slightly enough to know she was watching, still clutching that clipboard, but now with nothing left to control. Weeks went by, and the tension in Willow Bend began to ease. Without Janet's constant patrols, people started smiling more, waving at each other again. Lawns grew naturally instead of perfectly trimmed like soldiers in a row. It was as if the whole neighborhood had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. But Janet wasn't done, not entirely. She still showed up at meetings trying to cling to whatever authority she had left. Every time she spoke, though, someone would ask if the historical committee had approved her suggestion, and she would go silent, her voice shrinking smaller each time. One afternoon, while I was fixing a loose shutter, a man in a navy blazer walked up the driveway. He introduced himself as Mr. Collins from the historical committee. He thanked me for bringing the issue to their attention and explained that Janet's overreach had triggered a full audit of the HOA's practices. Apparently, several homeowners had been fined unfairly for things like flower bed colors and garden statues. Mr. Collins told me the committee had decided to classify my entire street as part of the official historical district, which meant the HOA could no longer enforce aesthetic rules at all. I was stunned. That meant not just me, but everyone nearby was free from Janet's control. That evening, neighbors gathered on the cul-de-sac, sharing lemonade and laughing like old friends. Someone brought out a grill, someone else turned on some soft music. It felt like a small-town celebration. Janet stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, watching everyone enjoy themselves, her usual command over the scene slipping through her fingers. She didn't say a word, but I could see the mixture of anger and defeat in her eyes. Later that night, she came to my door, her face tight with restrained emotion. "You humiliated me," she said quietly, her tone no longer sharp, just tired. I shook my head. "No, Janet, I didn't. You did this yourself. You could have talked to people instead of ordering them around. We all just wanted to live here peacefully." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders sagged. She turned and walked away without another word. From that day forward, Janet stopped making surprise inspections, her clipboard disappeared, and the HOA newsletters became shorter, kinder, almost human. I started spending more time outside, painting on the porch or tending to my roses. People would stop by to chat, ask about the house's history, even take photos. It was strange how something that began with a demand to repaint my home ended up restoring color to the whole neighborhood. As the weeks turned into months, the old community spirit came back strong. Families started hosting barbecues again. Kids rode their bikes down the street. Laughter filled the air. And every now and then I'd see Janet sitting on her porch, watching quietly, not the ruler of the block anymore, just another neighbor under the same soft golden evening light. One Sunday morning, I was sitting on my porch sipping coffee when Janet slowly walked up the path, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked different, softer, maybe even a little nervous. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and she took the seat across from me, her eyes wandering over the house, the freshly painted trim, the flower beds blooming along the walkway. "You really did a beautiful job," she said after a long silence. "It suits the house better than anything we had before." I thanked her and waited, unsure of where she was going with this. She sighed. "I thought keeping things perfect meant keeping control. I didn't realize I was making everyone miserable. I just wanted the neighborhood to look the way it used to when I first moved here." Her words caught me off guard for a moment. I almost saw her not as the overbearing HOA president, but as a woman who had simply lost her way, trying to hold on to something that mattered to her. Janet glanced at me, then at the street where a group of kids were drawing chalk art on the sidewalk, their laughter carried on the breeze. "They stopped being afraid of me," she said with a small smile. "I guess that's a good thing." "It is," I replied softly. "People will forgive a lot when they see someone trying to change." We sat in silence for a while, watching the children play, the sound of a lawn mower humming faintly in the distance. The neighborhood felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Eventually, Janet stood, brushed off her skirt, and said, "I stepped down from the HOA. I figured it was time someone else gave it a try, someone who listens." "That's a good choice," I said. She smiled, thanked me again, and walked back toward her house, moving slower than usual, but lighter somehow. After that day, things truly began to shift. New faces took over the HOA, and for once meetings were about helping rather than controlling. People discussed garden, street fairs, even a mural for the community center. And Janet, she kept to herself for the most part, but every now and then she'd show up to volunteer, planting flowers or helping hang banners during the town events. No clipboard in sight. The neighborhood had changed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The fences, once symbols of division, now framed yards filled with color, laughter, and open doors. Sometimes in the evening when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the porches, I'd catch sight of Janet sitting on her steps, watching the streetlights flicker on a soft smile on her face like she had finally found peace in the quiet she used to fear. As summer deepened, the neighborhood took on a new rhythm, cookouts, music, and children playing until dusk filled the air, the sound of life weaving through every street corner. Janet became a quiet fixture in it all, not the center of attention, but never quite apart anymore. She greeted people, waved at the mailman, even joined the block cleanup day, something no one ever expected from her. One afternoon, the historical committee held a small ceremony to officially recognize the district. They invited homeowners to share stories about their houses and the lives lived within their walls. I was asked to speak, and as I stood at the front of the crowd, I caught Janet's eyes in the audience. She smiled encouragingly, and that simple gesture felt like the final piece clicking into place. When I finished talking, the applause echoed through the square. Children clapped, adults cheered, and the warm sense of community wrapped around everyone like sunlight. After the ceremony, Janet approached holding a small envelope. She handed it to me and said, "I think this belongs to you. I found it when I was cleaning out the HOA office." Inside was an old photograph, yellowed and worn. It showed my house decades ago, painted the same deep shade it wore now, standing proud under the same oak tree, only younger. I looked up at her, surprised. She nodded quietly, saying, "I thought you might like to have it back. Turns out your color choice wasn't just beautiful, it was historical." I smiled and thanked her, and for the first time I saw genuine pride in her expression, not pride in control or authority, but pride in what the neighborhood had become. That evening, the community gathered in the park under string lights that swayed gently with the breeze. Someone played guitar, laughter mingled with music, and the scent of grilled food drifted through the air. Janet sat among us, her laughter soft but real. She leaned toward me and said, "Funny, isn't it? All this time I thought keeping things perfect meant rules and order. Turns out it just needed a little heart." I nodded, watching the kids run across the grass, their parents smiling, their homes glowing softly in the twilight, and for the first time in a long time, everything simply felt right. The neighborhood, once divided by strictness and fear, now thrived on understanding and warmth, and as the lights flickered above us, the town of Willow Bend felt alive again with color, music, and quiet redemption. As the days rolled into autumn, the air grew cooler, and the leaves began to shift from green to gold. The streets of Willow Bend looked like they had been painted by the season itself, every tree and every porch glowing under the soft orange sunlight. People decorated their houses not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was no longer about meeting HOA rules, it was about expressing who they were. Pumpkins lined porches, wreaths hung proudly on doors, and laughter echoed through open windows. One evening I saw Janet walking slowly along the sidewalk, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. She stopped to admire a group of kids carving pumpkins near the curb, her face warm with a quiet smile. When she noticed me, she waved and crossed the street, her steps slower now but steady. She sat down beside me on the porch, her eyes shining softly in the fading light. "You know, I used to dread this time of year," she said. "The decorations, the noise, the mess of leaves. I thought it made everything look untidy. Now I think it's beautiful." I smiled and nodded. The neighborhood always feels more alive when people stop worrying about how it looks and start enjoying it. Janet chuckled. "I used to think control meant respect. Now I see it just made people hide from me. I was trying to keep things perfect because I was afraid of losing what little order I thought I had left." Her words lingered between us, carried by the cool wind through the trees. The distant hum of crickets filled the silence. After a while, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded letter. It was an official notice from the HOA board thanking her for her years of service and inviting her to become an honorary advisor for community projects. She smiled as she handed it to me. "They actually want me to help plan the fall fair. Imagine that." I laughed softly. "I think you'll do a great job, as long as you let the kids pick the colors this time." She laughed too, and for the first time her laughter didn't sound sharp or forced. It was warm, genuine, like she had finally let something go. As night settled across the neighborhood, string lights flickered on. One by one, families gathered outside, sharing hot cider and stories under the glowing trees, and for the first time in many years, every corner of Willow Bend felt connected. Janet looked around, taking it all in, her expression thoughtful, yet peaceful, her voice barely above a whisper, when she said, "I think this is what I was trying to protect all along. I just went about it the wrong way." The breeze rustled the leaves, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the air. The stars began to appear faint at first, then brighter, reflecting off the old windows of the houses that now stood proudly side by side, each one unique, yet part of something whole. Winter came softly to Willow Bend, dusting the roofs and lawns with pale snowflakes that sparkled beneath the streetlights. The neighborhood seemed quieter now, calmer, yet more alive than ever before. Children built snowmen along the sidewalks, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Neighbors waved from their porches, sipping hot cocoa bundled in scarves and coats. The air was full of warmth even in the cold. Janet had taken to walking every morning through the snow, her boots crunching on the path. She carried birdseed in her pocket, scattering it near the oak trees, the same trees she once tried to have trimmed for looking uneven. One morning I saw her pause in front of my gate, the same old fence she once demanded I repaint. She brushed off the snow from the top rail and smiled to herself. "Looks like it held up just fine," she said, turning to me with a grin as I stepped outside. "It did," I replied, smiling back. "Guess the historical committee knew what they were talking about." She laughed softly and nodded, then handed me a small tin of cookies. "I baked too much again, thought you might help me out." I thanked her and invited her, and we sat by the fireplace, sipping coffee, watching the snow fall through the wide front window. For a while neither of us spoke, just listened to the quiet crackle of the fire. Janet looked around the house, taking in the old furniture, the framed photographs, and the smell of cedar and warmth. "This place has history," she said softly. "It feels alive, like it remembers everyone who ever lived here." It does, I told her. "Every nail, every creak has a story. This house has seen generations come and go." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I think I finally understand what makes it special. It's not the rules or the paint or the fences, it's the people who care for it, the ones who see beauty in the cracks and stories in the walls." Outside, the snow began to thicken, blanketing the street in silence. Lights glowed softly behind frosted windows, families gathering inside, warmth spilling out into the night. Janet stood to leave, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. She paused at the door, turned back, and said quietly, "Thank you for not giving up on this place or on me." I smiled. "You just needed time, Janet. That's all. Sometimes even the strictest rules need a little thawing." She laughed quietly, stepped out into the snow, and waved before walking down the street, her footsteps fading softly into the winter night as the glow of the streetlights followed her path through the calm and peaceful neighborhood of Willow Bend. The days slowly stretched into the quiet heart of winter, the kind where everything moved a little slower and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and pine. The neighborhood stayed warm in its own small ways. Lights twinkled on porches, families gathered for dinner, and laughter echoed faintly through frosted windows. Janet kept her morning walks even when the snow piled high. She would wave at neighbors, clear small paths for the mailboxes, and stop by to chat with the older residents she once scolded about their lawn decorations. Everyone noticed the change. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was steady and real. One morning, as I shoveled my driveway, she came by holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed me one, smiling without saying a word, and together we watched the slow fall of snowflakes drifting through the gray sky. "You know," she said after a while, "I think this neighborhood is better than it's ever been. Not perfect, but better. I never thought I'd see everyone get along like this." I smiled. "I think people just needed to breathe again. Rules can't build a community, kindness can." She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "I used to think I was keeping things safe, but I was really keeping people apart. It's strange how easy it is to mistake order for peace." A group of children ran by, dragging a bright red sled, laughing as they slid down the small hill near the end of the street, their joy filling the stillness around us. Janet watched them, her eyes soft and full of something close to wonder. Later that afternoon, we helped hang garlands around the old oak trees together. Neighbors came out to join us, bringing ladders, ribbons, and music from a small speaker. By the time the sun began to set, the whole street glowed golden against the snow. Someone handed Janet a mug of cider, and for a moment, everyone gathered around her, not because she was in charge, but because she was part of them again. She looked around at all the smiling faces, the homes glowing with lights and warmth, and said quietly under her breath, "This is what I always wanted. I just didn't know how to get here." The wind picked up, then gentle but steady, and the garlands swayed softly above us. The sound of bells from the church at the edge of town carried through the evening air. As the first stars appeared above the quiet roofs, Janet turned to me and said, "I think Willow Bend finally feels like home again, don't you?" I nodded, and for the first time since I had moved there I truly felt it too, a place once ruled by rules now held together by understanding, warmth, and the simple beauty of neighbors who finally learned how to live side by side. Spring came softly to Willow Bend, melting the last traces of snow and filling the air with the scent of new beginnings. Buds bloomed along the sidewalks, birds returned to the trees, and the soft hum of lawnmowers replaced the quiet crunch of winter boots. Janet had started tending a small garden in front of her porch. She planted wildflowers instead of the perfect uniform roses she once insisted on. Her hands were always smudged with dirt now, and she smiled more often, her laughter echoing faintly down the street as she greeted passers-by. One morning, she stopped by my house carrying a basket filled with early blooms, daisies, tulips, and little blue forget-me-nots. She said they reminded her of the way the neighborhood used to look before everything became so strict and polished. I took the basket and thanked her. We stood there in the soft sunlight watching a pair of children ride their bikes down the road, their wheels kicking up dust as they laughed and shouted to each other. "You remember when no one would even let kids play in the street?" she said, shaking her head. "I can't believe I ever thought that was a good idea." "You were trying to keep things safe," I said kindly. "Sometimes people confuse quiet with peace." Janet nodded. "I think I was just afraid of change. This neighborhood was my last real connection to my husband before he passed. I kept it perfect because I didn't know what else to hold on to." Her voice trembled slightly, and for a moment the air between us grew still. Then she smiled again. "But now it's different. I still miss him, but when I see how happy everyone is, I think he'd be proud of that." I smiled and said I think he would too. As the days passed, more color-filled Willow Bend porches painted in soft greens and blues, window boxes overflowing with flowers, people sitting outside in the evenings sharing food and stories, the sound of guitars and laughter drifting through the dusk. Janet became something of a quiet hero to everyone, not because she led, but because she learned. She joined the book club at the library, helped plant trees near the lake, and spent her weekends organizing yard sales where neighbors traded stories as much as items. Sometimes in the evenings she would stop by my porch with 2 cups of tea, and we would sit watching the street as the sun dipped low, painting everything in shades of gold, and rose, the same light reflecting off the old houses that now stood proudly, each one different, yet somehow belonging together. And every time she looked around, Janet's eyes would soften with the same quiet wonder, as if she was seeing Willow Bend for the very first time. As summer approached, Willow Bend felt alive in a way it never had before. The sound of sprinklers mixed with laughter and the distant hum of music drifting from open windows. Every porch seemed to tell its own story, each painted in colors that reflected the people who lived inside. Janet had become a familiar sight in the mornings, walking her small terrier down the street, the same street she once inspected with a clipboard. Now she stopped to chat with neighbors, share tomatoes from her garden, and pet every dog that ran up to greet her. One weekend, the neighborhood decided to host a summer fair, something that hadn't been done in years. The idea came from the new HOA board, but it was Janet who volunteered to help organize it. She was the first to hang banners, the first to bring lemonade, and the last to leave after cleaning up. When the day of the fair arrived, the park at the edge of Willow Bend was filled with booths, laughter, and music. Children ran between stalls with painted faces, and adults sat on picnic blankets, enjoying the warmth of the sun. The air smelled of grilled food and fresh-cut grass. Janet stood near the stage, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a smile that reached her eyes. She waved at me as I walked up, carrying a tray of pastries she had baked the night before. Her energy was contagious. She greeted everyone with kindness and familiarity. The mayor of the town even showed up to say a few words about how Willow Bend had become a model neighborhood for cooperation and unity. When he mentioned Janet by name, the crowd erupted in applause. She looked around, stunned, her hand pressed her chest, her eyes glistening. After the speech, she turned to me, almost shyly whispering, "I never thought I'd be clapped for in this neighborhood. I used to be the one people avoided." "People change," I said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is realizing the walls we build keep us out just as much as they keep others away." She smiled, a little tear slipping down her cheek. "Maybe that's true, maybe. I just needed to let go of the rules long enough to see what I was missing." As the evening settled and the sun dipped low, the sky turned shades of pink and gold, lanterns flickered on, and the fair lights shimmered across the park. Music filled the air once again. Janet sat on a bench watching the children dance near the stage, her laughter mixing with theirs, a picture of peace and joy. She leaned back, her eyes soft, her smile wide, the years of tension and loneliness washed away by the simple beauty of belonging. The fair continued into the night, and the glow of the lights reflected off the calm faces of the people who had once lived in quiet resentment, now joined together in something far greater than rules or fences, something that felt like home. As night settled gently over Willow Bend, the fair began to wind down. The music softened, the lanterns swayed in the warm summer breeze, and the laughter faded into a peaceful hum under the stars. Janet sat quietly on the bench, watching the families pack up their booths, children yawning in their parents' arms, fireflies blinking softly through the tall grass. She took a slow, deep breath, as if letting go of something she had carried for far too long. I walked over and sat beside her, handing her a cup of lemonade. She smiled and said softly, "I never thought I'd see the neighborhood like this. It feels alive again." "It always was," I said. "You just helped it find its way back." She looked around, her gaze drifting from one glowing porch to another. The same homes she had once seen as problems now shone like small beacons of warmth. Her voice wavered when she said, "I used to think leadership meant control. Now I think it just means care." We sat in silence after that, listening to the distant hum of crickets and the faint laughter still floating through the evening air. The moon hung above the rooftops, bathing everything in silver light. When the last of the fairgoers left, Janet stood and brushed the dust from her skirt. She looked down the street one more time, the street she once ruled and now simply belonged to her, smile gentle and content. "Thank you," she said, "not just for standing up to me, but for showing me there was another way." "You did the hard part," one replied. "You changed." She laughed softly and nodded. Maybe it just took a few wrong turns to find the right road. As she walked back toward her home, the glow of porch lights followed her steps, the neighborhood wrapped in peace and understanding, each house a story, each family a thread woven into something stronger. And as I stood there watching her fade into the golden light, I realized that Willow Bend wasn't just a place. It was a reminder that even the hardest hearts can soften, even the strictest rules can bend, and that sometimes the truest kind of perfection comes from simply learning how to live together. The night air carried the last echoes of laughter through the quiet streets, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt whole again.